Today, I want to go over a few things. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of protest at the Olympics, some alternative events, and a little bit about the apartheid boycott. Although, to be honest, I had so much material, I didn't really get into the whole apartheid issue, but we'll talk about that at the end. So to begin, most people believe that the Olympics began in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But if you actually look at the history, what we're now discovering, it's many of the games that are played in the Olympics were actually first played in Africa by the ancient Egyptians, possibly by Sumerians and other cultures, but certainly by the Egyptians. The sports that the Egyptians introduced to what we today know as the Olympics include the following: archery, rowing, handball, competitive swimming, hockey, weightlifting, tug of war, gymnastics, javelin, jumping, running, boxing, wrestling, and equestrian sports, so horse riding of different kinds. Unfortunately, as I was doing the research for this presentation, we don't really know much more than that about the history of sport in ancient Egypt. It seems that the ancient Egyptian chroniclers didn't really keep very close. They weren't as obsessed with sport as later the Greeks and the Romans would be. That's probably why we don't have as good records. The ancient Olympics under the name Olympics, which is a Greek name, those started in about the 8th century before the Common Era, 8th century BCE. They were a big deal throughout the Greek times and also into the Roman times. So in the 2nd century of the Common Era, so about, well, actually I think it's the 1st century of the Common Era, about the year 70 or 80, the Roman Emperor Nero, he famously violated all the rules when he delayed the games for 2 years so that he himself could compete. He wanted to race a chariot, and when he crashed in his chariot and was too injured to compete, because he was the emperor, he was still crowned the victor, and that victory was only annulled after he died. The Olympics were seen as a politics-free zone, in the sense that wars were stopped so that the games could take place. I'm talking about big wars, the Peloponnesian Wars, the biggest wars of ancient Greece, still allowed for the Olympics to take place in their 4-year cycle. There were also big money. So famously, there was a boxer from Alexandria who arrived too late to compete. And he claimed some excuse that his horse was delayed or something, but in fact he was fighting somewhere else and making money somewhere else. So he was excluded from the competition, and in his anger he started to, as his opponent was being crowned without actually having a fight, he started punching his opponent, and those kind of illegal actions, they caused players and coaches. Slide out. Oh, sorry, I forgot to share my screen. That's very funny. Sorry. So this was the screen on ancient Egypt. Sorry, I couldn't find a better picture on that. And this is what I've been trying to show on Greek and Romans. So it's all about cheating. It's all about bribery. It's all about scandal. When this particular boxer, who was the most famous boxer of the age, could not compete, he started beating up. He started fighting with the person who was being crowned the victor, and was later forced to pay a huge fine. Those kind of violations did incur fines, and there was enough fines to build several statues to the god Zeus out of gold. So it was a lot of money being made by the Olympic, what we would today call the Olympic Committee, as well. Sorry. The first form of protest that I could find in the ancient games involves the role of women. So women were they weren't allowed to compete, which I think many of us may know, but they weren't even allowed anywhere near the games. They weren't allowed in the stands. They weren't allowed behind the scenes. There's one famous incident where the mother of one of the competitors sort of snuck in and then got found out, and it was a big mess. But what women did almost immediately, according to some accounts, is that they started their own version of the Olympics, where only women were allowed to compete. Some accounts of these alternative Olympics, so the Hera, it's to the goddess Hera, so I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but it's Heraean Games. So some people say that those games go as far back as the Olympics themselves. Others say they started a little bit later, so the Olympics themselves started in the 8th century BCE. Others say, this may have started in the 2nd or 3rd century BCE, so 400 or 500 years later. And there's not really enough documentation to say which of these may be true. Okay, getting to the modern era. So that's the history of protest in the ancient world, or some of it. In the modern era, so when the Olympics began around the end of the 19th century, as part of the nationalist sort of movements there, you have this competitor here. His name was Peter O'Connor. In 1906, in the Athens Olympics, he was representing Ireland. He showed up expecting to represent Ireland, but Ireland at that point wasn't a country. Remember, Ireland wouldn't become independent until 1937. So it didn't have representation in the Olympic Committee. He was therefore forced to compete for Britain. And you can imagine, as someone who was protesting against British colonialism in Ireland, he was not particularly happy about that. And so when he won the silver in his first event, he climbed the flagpole and replaced the British flag with the Irish flag, with an Irish flag that he had brought from his own home. This is before, as I said, this is before Ireland became free of Britain in 1937, and it's seen as a very important protest. And one, of course, that the Olympic Committee wasn't too happy about. These kind of protests, I should say, much later in 1975, will lead to the so-called Section 50 of the Olympic Code, which we'll talk about a bit later, which prohibits protest of all forms. So the 1936 Olympics, I think many people would know about this. The Berlin Olympics, so what happened was, I'll get to the story of how the Olympics were held in Berlin in the first place. But the location was decided on in 1931. In 1933, Adolf Hitler unexpectedly becomes Chancellor of Germany, and then he gets rid of the president in 1934. The idea of an apolitical Olympics in Nazi Germany is a bit of a joke, right? And it was a highly charged affair, with Hitler hoping that the Games will be a showcase of Germany's Aryan power. Jesse Owens, an American black athlete, and other black athletes, they end up sort of spoiling the show for Hitler, who wants to make this big show of German strength and so on. And there's a lot written about that side of the story, but there are other sides of the story that are less well known. One story that I'll just touch on briefly is the story of Johann Trollmann, who was certainly one of the best boxers of his era, and possibly one of the best boxers ever. We don't really know, because he didn't compete enough. He was not allowed to compete in 1936, and he had his title, so he was German champion. His title was stripped away from him after he decisively beat his German opponent in 1933. His crime was that he was a member of the Sinto-Roma community, so-called, some people refer to them as gypsies, although that's also seen as a derogatory term these days. And because he was a member of the Roma community, he underwent forced sterilization. He was sent to the Eastern Front, and he got injured and returned back. When he returned, he was put in a concentration camp, and he died in the concentration camp in 1944. It's a remarkable story, and one that we don't know enough about. So the 1936 Olympics themselves very nearly didn't take place. The Olympic Committee was split almost 50-50. So some members wanted the games completely canceled in protest of the Nazi takeover of the country. And remember that it's not just that they came to power, they suspended civil liberties, they suspended the Constitution in 1934 and 1935. So it was a very close vote, as I say. If two more members had objected, the Olympic Games would have been canceled, or they would have been held somewhere else. But some of the organizers split off and started this very remarkable event in Olympic history. So they said, look, we're not going to participate in this. It's a sham. We're going to host the People's Olympics, the Popular Olympics. It's going to be in Barcelona. Barcelona was a working class city, was controlled at that time by leftists and by trade unions. And this is in the middle of what we would today refer to as the Spanish Civil War, although at the time it wasn't clear what was going on exactly. The teams that were going to gather there included an exiled team of German Jews who had already fled the Nazi regime, as well as teams from the United States, from France, from the United Kingdom, as well as places that didn't want to represent a country, but rather a region. So these were regions that were fighting for their own independence. They included Alsace, the Basque country, and Catalonia. Trade unions from around the world were the main sponsors of these games. Unfortunately, the fascist forces, so this is Franco's army, started firing on Barcelona a few days before the game. So those games never took place. In fact, there's a story of the Jewish athletes who were sort of stuck at the border and couldn't even enter Spain. Some of the athletes fought on the side of the Spanish Republic. So some people went there to compete. They went there to do long jump or whatever. But they ended up picking up arms for the Spanish Republic. And one athlete, I believe a French athlete, actually died. Others, especially the Americans who were there, recruited more Americans to go and join and fight for the Republic, for the Spanish Republic, along with such people as Ernest Hemingway, very famously also fought for the Spanish Republic. Okay, so that's 1936. I mean, there's a lot more we could say about 1936, but we'll leave it at that for now. Perhaps the most famous protest is this one here. So you see, this was in 1968 in Mexico City. So all three of the players that you see, so Tommy Smith from the US who won gold, Peter Norman from Australia who won second place, so he won silver, and John Carlos also from the US who won bronze, all three are participating in the protest. And all three were punished. Okay, Peter Norman, the Australian, he was excluded from future Australian teams. John Carlos and Tommy Smith were punished much more severely, obviously. The protest, as you can see, involved giving the Black Power salute on the podium. This is a salute that had been popularized by the Black Panther Party. And remember, this is a few months after Reverend Martin Luther King has been killed. There have been massive race riots all over the U.S. A couple of years before that, Malcolm X was killed. So the whole country is really on fire. And these two Black American athletes are wearing clothing associated with the Olympic Project for Human Rights, which was a group that had been encouraging Black athletes and those in solidarity with Black athletes to boycott the Olympics altogether. So one interesting thing I found out when researching this one is that there's a guy called Avery Brundage, who was an American. At that point, he must have been very old in 1968, because he was the head of the Olympic Committee, so the International Olympic Committee, both in 1936, when people were going around giving the Nazi salute everywhere, and in 1968. So he was in charge of both, and he was defending those who were giving the Nazi salute in 1936. And he took it upon himself to punish these athletes as much as possible. They were immediately kicked out of the Olympic Village. Their stuff was unceremoniously thrown out of the tents. They were never allowed to compete for national teams ever again. And only in 2013, they're both still alive. You can hear interviews with them. They're both very articulate. Only recently, in 2013, did a statement that was somewhat supportive. Even then, you can't call it completely supportive, but somewhat supportive of those two athletes. Did it appear on the IOC's website, on the website of the International Olympic Committee? So really, it is justice delayed a long time. Okay, I'm going to forward. There's a lot I could talk about as well. And I think before I forward on from here, I think it's important to say that there was an arm of the anti-apartheid movement that focused on sport. And Shireen and I both had the honor of meeting and spending time. In fact, he was on our board for several years. There's a man called Dennis Brutus, a famous South African poet, who headed the campaign internationally to exclude South Africa from sport. And so for many years, South Africa was not allowed to compete in the Olympics, nor were they allowed to compete in international football, in international rugby, in international cricket. And that is one of the things that is seen as playing a big role in sort of, ending apartheid had many different fronts in the war to end apartheid. So you had armed resistance, you had nonviolent resistance, you had global resistance. But the idea that South Africans couldn't compete in global sport, it kind of annoyed certain constituencies within South Africa, especially white constituencies that would have liked to compete in international sport, which may be one of the reasons that apartheid fell as well. So it definitely played a role. But I'm going to forward to right now, today. And in the current Olympics that are wrapping up today, in fact, they've already wrapped up this morning, well, at least in my time zone, they've wrapped up in the morning. In Japan, I believe it was the afternoon. So the first thing is just the circumstances. COVID has caused the games to be postponed until 2021, although they're still using the term 2020 Olympics. And many of the events are taking place without crowds due to the new rules, social distancing, and so on. Tokyo is experiencing a spike, an increase in infections. It's not thought that that's due to the games, but just coincidentally, that seems to be the case. The global pandemic has also made it very difficult for players to train in the normal way that they would before a competition, and this may be one of the reasons that a few high-profile athletes have chosen to withdraw from the competition or from some aspects of the competition instead of competing. Right. So there's a mental health discussion that has been postponed and that we're now seeming to have as a result of these Olympics in part. And then there's even more dramatic things, right? So we have an actual defector. Her name is KRYSTSINA TSIMANOUSKAYA. And the interesting thing about this person, she's from Belarus, she's not seeking asylum for political reasons, right? At least not the kind of political reasons that one might expect. She claims that her coaches entered her into an event that she didn't want to run and then tried to force her to return to Belarus when she voiced her objections to running in that particular race. As of this moment, and I believe it's as of yesterday, she's arrived in Poland and she's seeking a sort of more formal asylum status, but is currently there as a sort of guest of the Polish government. So that's one very famous protest that's happened. This is another. This is Raven Saunders. She's a U.S. track and field athlete who won silver in the shot put. This gesture, this sort of X she made on the podium, when asked to describe it, she said it's linked to the Black Lives Matter movement. It's linked to her own identity as a queer black woman, as a lesbian. She says it's the intersection. She says that X that she's making is the intersection where all oppressed people meet. So an interesting and poetic protest. The Olympic Committee was looking into that until today. I believe today she got news that her mother passed away. And so the Olympic Committee has suspended its investigation into this protest. We also had, day before yesterday was the anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. The anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki is tomorrow, I believe. And the mayor of Hiroshima asked permission. He sort of made a formal petition to the Olympic Committee to say, look, that bomb dropped at 8:15. At 8:15, hundreds of thousands of people died. Please, can we have a moment of silence at 8:15 on August the 6th? That request was denied by the Olympic Committee. But at least he publicized the fact that he made that. So that's also a form of protest, making it known that he made that request. There's something to be said also about India. So India's hockey especially has done pretty well as one track and field athlete. The women's hockey team did very well, but they failed to win a medal, while the men's hockey team did win the bronze medal, so they won sort of third place. The women's team got attacked by some Indian supporters, I won't say all Indian supporters, for, quote, having too many Dalits, so lower caste people, right? And I'd urge you, if you're on this meeting, if you're listening to this and you don't quite know what that means, I'd urge you to go and look at our previous discussions on caste. So this kind of casteist bias in sport, it's not something we've seen before at this level and this openly. I mean, it may, there were always biases. I won't say that it wasn't there, but people having the audacity to just criticize someone because of their birth, because of their caste, is kind of, wow, it's a whole new level. I also heard something, and maybe there's some people on the call who can confirm or deny this, but one of the men's hockey players, I believe the hockey captain, there was a rumor going around Facebook that he refused the 1 crore cash prize from the Indian government until the farm bills are withdrawn. But I haven't been able to confirm that. I have a feeling it's a fake news. Okay, so what are some of the lessons we can talk about here? What I've given you so far is really a whole bunch of disconnected anecdotes, right? But what connects them? I think there are a few things that connect them. Number one, this is a time, the Olympics and so on, and sporting events in general, this is a time when the eyes of the world are on athletes. They're on you if you're an athlete, right? So the athletes knew that. They knew that they had the world's attention, whether it's, a man in 1906 demanding that he represent Ireland and not the UK, or whether it's people giving the Black Power support salute in 1968, or some of these things that are going on at this Olympics, they know that they have the world's attention, and therefore they feel that they have an obligation to use that attention to do something good, right? That's lesson number one. Lesson number two is that the powers that be can't really stop the protest, right? So you have this Article 50, you have all these kind of things. But whenever they try to flex their muscles and completely shut down the protest, it backfires. I could have mentioned many, many more protests here, but the ones that the committee has tried to punish end up being the most famous. So anyone who knows anything at all about Olympics history knows the names of Tommy Smith and John Carlos and their protest in 1968. But can anyone remember anything about, I don't know, the 1972 Olympics or the 1964 Olympics? 1968 becomes famous precisely because of those protests. So it's exactly, the effect that they're trying to have. They want to silence the protest. It ends up magnifying the importance of those protests. It ends up amplifying those protests. Is it clear? The third thing I'll say is that everything is political. Now, this is something we know and we've discussed on other webinars that we've done. For example, there's a discussion with Professor Rampunyani, who was, I believe, a physics professor or some kind of professor of science. And he decided that he had to speak out after the Babri Masjid demolition. Even though he was a scientist by training, he felt like he had no choice. It was the moral thing to do because remaining silent was itself a political choice, right? So in that context, consider again 1936. To show up, just to be present while Hitler is forcing all of his German athletes to salute him, just to be part of that. In some ways, it was an endorsement of the regime, right? I think that was especially the case for sort of mainstream athletes. But for others, for example, Jesse Owens, a Black American athlete who dominated those games, who won a lot of medals, it ended up being about something else, right? It's about claiming his dignity as a black person and as an athlete at a time when dignity was a rare commodity, not just for him, but for most of the human race, right? For anyone who wasn't, a white European on the face of the earth in the 1960s, it was a difficult time, right? So with that, I think we'll end with this quote from Jesse Owens, who says, he wasn't invited to shake hands with Hitler, but I wasn't invited to the White House to shake hands with the president either, right? So for him, it's a matter of finding dignity, and he did that through through competing. When I was researching Jesse Owens, he doesn't have a lot of quotes. He's one of those people who let his athletic achievements speak for him. But they were amazing athletic achievements, and they really destroyed what Hitler was trying to do with those games, which was to showcase the superiority of the Aryan race. So with that, we can take any questions, any comments, any thoughts that anyone might have. Let's take a look at the chat.
Also, it is a pleasure to have people join from the West Coast and also from Canada, along with our friends from Europe and India, of course. Also, I see one person from South Africa, a couple of people from Dubai. We are very happy that you are able to join this program. It is a short presentation, but an important presentation about the history of Olympics. That aspect of history that is not well known, but it is important for us as peace activists to discuss what strategies we can use to get our message across to the world. And one of the ways we can do it is to use high-profile events and high-profile gatherings to do so. In this case, it's the Olympics, where sportsmen and sportswomen have done this for the world. So thank you once again for coming. I'd like to remind everyone that our next Islamophobia workshop to fight against Islamophobia is, Samir, could you please give that information, please?
Sure, I will just bring up that slide. 1 second, please. So that is going to be on September the 4th at 7:30 p.m. India time, which is 10 a.m. Eastern and 4 p.m. in Europe. So that's September 4th.
And if you want to register for that workshop, I'm putting the email address there. It is info@peacevigil.net, which is where you can send us an email if you're interested in joining that workshop.
Thanks. So I'm happy to take any questions if there are any questions. I mean, I think, you know, we can talk a little bit more about the work of, you know, how isolating South Africa in these spaces was not easy. And I think it is time for a similar campaign against Israel. In fact, there are people who are conducting a similar campaign talking about apartheid in Israel as well. So it's still a tactic that can be used, and with quite a degree of success, because these are places where national prestige is sort of on the line. And so I think it can be quite powerful. Or else, if there are no thoughts, we can leave it at that. It's a short presentation, but that's fine if no one has any questions, comments, thoughts.
There was a hand raised just now. Can you see? There was somebody who raised their hand.
No, I don't see any hands raised right now.
Okay, so I guess we will wind up now. Thank you, Samir, for the research that you put into this presentation. We can have a more detailed discussion about various avenues or spaces of protest that people have used over the years, which are considered apolitical or non-political. Definitely, Olympics is not considered political, but it has been used. There is a question: have any of these protests made any tangible impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think they all do to some extent. You know, I think that the John Carlos and Tommy, sorry, I'm forgetting. I want to make sure that I get the names correct. Yeah, Tommy Smith and John Carlos in 1968. I mean, I think that really, maybe not immediately. So you know, in the immediate aftermath, those two were exiled. They were ostracized. It was very tough for them. But when they got sort of exposure in the African American community, when they did interviews and so on and talked about what they were doing, I mean, it was part of a whole cultural change in the US that occurred between the 1960s and maybe even today, right? So I think it's massive changes. And as I said, the apartheid thing, like isolating South Africa in that sense, really did put pressure on South Africa to come to the negotiating table with the ANC, put pressure on the Afrikaner government, white government, to actually come and negotiate in Lusaka with the African National Congress and other parties, right? So again, I don't want to simplify these stories and say that it's just the protest that actually made the difference. But there is no doubt that the use of these platforms has made some difference in every time.
Yeah, I would like to add, by the way, this is Shireen. Sorry, my video is not on, but this is Shireen from Peace Vigil. A couple of things I'd like to say about this is, number one, that any change in the world comes with collective work. So nowhere, even if you look at histories of India or, you know, in general South Asia, no one protest or one action has led to change. So it's collective stuff that happens and builds a momentum that leads to change. So it will be hard for Olympics protests or any other kind of protest to actually lead to change. But they collectively with other protests lead to a situation which makes change possible. So raising the profile of an injustice that is being done, you know, raising the profile of struggles around the world, that is what a protest does. And in the case of Olympics, there's a captive audience, there's international attention. And so the use of Olympics is important in that respect. I don't think that it can lead to change directly. It works in tandem with other protests and other work that's going around the world. Secondly, I would like to again reiterate the whole South Africa experience, because you have to remember that South Africa could not compete in the Olympic Games from 1964 to 88. Now, that is a very long time. And what it did was not only create awareness around the world about what was happening in South Africa, what the apartheid regime was doing, but also it raised questions within South Africa, within the country. People were asking, why is it that the world is not accepting our athletes? Why is it that we can't send a team to Olympics? What is it? Why are we hated so much? Why is the world against us? And to answer that question was very difficult for the apartheid regime. That led to change within South Africa, where people started to understand that this is really wrong. The world hates us for this. There's another question here. Don't you think that the form and extent of protest depends at least partly on the conditions prevailing in the country against which the cause of protest originates? For example, the caste slurs against Indian players at Tokyo reflects the BJP's agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a valid point. I mean, I think, the BJP itself would claim, of course, they would claim that that's not their agenda, but what they have inculcated within India is a culture of exclusionism, a culture of bigotry, if you like. And so within that context, the anti-caste slurs make a lot of sense. But I think, in a larger context, we can say that, I think I've seen this sort of stuff beginning to rise up over the last 20 or 30 years in India, right? So it's not that it's just the BJP, and I'm talking under Congress regimes as well. So I remember there was a situation where was an India-Pakistan match 15 years ago or so, and it was Sachin Tendulkar who sort of made a century very famously. Sachin has a reputation for playing very well against Pakistan. And someone somewhere on social media or something was turning that into like a Hindu versus Muslim thing, because without even thinking that I think the man who was supporting Sachin, so the other batsman, was a Muslim whose name I'm forgetting, Muhammad Kaif, I think. So anyway, this is, in the Indian context, it's a little bit difficult because I think the tendency towards more exclusionary society has been going on a long time. It's not just the BJP, although it is the RSS, which is one of the main things behind that, as you will know, Marjorie, as you've attended others of our events. But I think you're very right. There's definitely a chauvinism within certain countries that leads to especially the sort of ugly kind of protest that we see. And on the flip side, it may be the case that the more positive kind of protest that we're seeing, American gymnasts saying, I'm not going to risk my mental health in order to compete in this. It's not worth it. That's a very brave thing for an athlete to say.
Samir, also, I will add that there are things that are not talked about in a country because they're not considered important enough because of, say, the numbers of people that are being impacted. It could be a small minority. So, for instance, in the case of the northeastern part of India, there was an athlete who competed in the Olympics and won a medal, who went on record to say that the northeastern people are considered Indian only if they bring in medals, otherwise they are not. And so I think what happens is that this kind of a protest becomes extremely important within India, since we are talking about, say, the Muslim minority, the atrocities against Muslim minorities. We are also talking about atrocities against Christian minorities, but about the Northeast, not much is spoken or done. And so it may even bring to light certain things that we as activists are not paying as much attention to as we should. And this case of the Northeastern, I think she's a weightlifter, although I'm not sure. She said that.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating couple of weeks. But with that, if there are no more questions, again, I'll urge everyone to go ahead and sign up for that Islamophobia workshop on September 4th. and to check out more videos about casteism, racism, and so on our website. And thanks very much for attending, and we'll see you next time.
Yes, please do share this video, which will be on YouTube very soon. You can share it with others. Please do subscribe to the YouTube channel, Peace Vigil's YouTube channel, and also send us an email on info@peacevigil.net if you'd like to participate in the next workshop against Islamophobia, which will be on 4th of September. It's an interactive workshop. We take very few people. If you're interested, you can send us an email. Thank you once again for attending this lecture, this presentation on the history of Olympics as protest across the world, and also in the present circumstances that becomes even more important. Thanks. I remember that sadly Mary Com joined BJP. You're right, Nidhi, that did happen. Yes. Thank you so much for attending, everyone, from all over the world. This was a short presentation, and we are very happy that you were able to join. Once again, we send you our warmest from Peace Vigil, Johannesburg, South Africa, a country that witnessed the apartheid, went through apartheid, and got support from around the world to fight against that unjust system. One of the ways that was done was by banning South Africa from the Olympics, which was done because of public pressure around the world. Thank you, Marjorie. Yes, thank you. It was good to have you at this session.